Welcome to the Regulatory Dialogue by the IOSCO Asia Pacific Hub in Kuala Lumpur. With me, I have Professor Didier Cossin, who is the founder and director of IMD Global Board Center. His area of expertise is actually a very long list, which includes, amongst other things, leadership, board effectiveness, governance, and strategy design. He is also a strong advocate in stewardship, and in this regard, he has actually co-authored a book, Inspiring Stewardship. We're going to take this opportunity to discuss with Prof. his views on leadership, particularly steward leadership. We'll also discuss conditions to nurture stewardship and the relationship, if any, between corporate governance and stewardship. Prof, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
And thank you for being with us today.
It's a pleasure.
I'd like to start this discussion by seeking your thoughts on leadership approaches post the global financial crisis. Post the global financial crisis, I've noticed that, with the continuous spate of corporate collapses and scandals that are taking place, the public has, lost trust in corporations, have started to question leadership legitimacy, and also began to discuss and debate ethical consciousness in corporations. The public demands a new breed of leaders. At least this is how I think, looking at it from the reports that have come out. And these leaders are supposed to be people who can provide ethical direction to their employees, develop ethical, moral development in corporations, and at the same time, perhaps look at wider interests as opposed to just looking at the interests of the shareholders. They want leaders who can actually bring about positive impact on environment and on society. So post the global financial crisis, it seems that there's been a lot of new leadership approaches, some of which I came across, which I would like to ask you, is ethical leadership. In fact, one CEO said that in an interdependent world, there can't be any other kind of leadership but ethical leadership. Then we have sustainable leadership, which actually talks about or embraces the three bottom line concept. Then, having read your book, Inspiring Stewardship, I've come across what we call leader stewardship, leaders who actually make an impact, drive social good, secure the future. So, Prof, if I may, I'd like to ask, are there any differences in all these various approaches that have been advocated? And if they are different, can they be reconciled?
Yes, of course, they're very different and they are very easy to reconcile, actually. Stewardship is a theory by itself. It's a theory that's long dated. If you want, in the 70s, the theory of agency dominated the conceptual world of the firm. And the theory of agency is really about control and conflicts. And what we see today is the fact that people are actually driven to do the right thing. We are better off doing the right thing. And so ethical leadership is about that, doing the right thing. Now, stewardship, of course, necessitates ethical leadership. So you need to be ethical to be a good steward. But stewardship is more than that, because stewardship is a spirit of growth. It's a spirit of success. If you want, a good example is you can preserve value by being ethical. Yes. Preserving value is not stewardship. Stewardship is about growth, about agility, innovation, and combining that with integrity. The idea is not only to have integrity, but to have positive impact in society and to transform society for the better. And thus, if you want, stewardship is more fundamental. And we have good classical philosophical examples of that, that date back to several centuries. This idea is that you're actually doing a service to society. And so it's not only having integrity, but it's being productive with that integrity.
So, Prof, in short, you're saying that stewardship actually is wider than ethical leadership?
That's correct. Ethical leadership is, and I wouldn't even call it ethical leadership. Being ethical is a necessary condition.
I see.
And the quote you gave earlier is very good about that. You cannot be successful as a steward without being ethical. So it's a necessity. But being ethical doesn't mean that you're good at growing the economy, growing the well-being, etc. Right? I mean, you know, a religious person can be extremely ethical and very bad at running a business, right? And so stewardship is that combination, right, of the growth mindset, the agility, also some ownership, right, at growing things. It's being of service, but of active service to society via business.
And how does one distinguish leader stewardship from sustainable leadership?
So there again, I would say sustainable leadership has several interpretations. One is simply sustainability in an environmental sense, right? Which again, you know, it's very hard in my view to go against the climate, right, and being a good steward. Within the good steward, you have this idea of being the guardian of the house, of being able to leave for the next generation something better, right? So there is a long-term view. So I would argue the sustainability is part of that long-term view. There is also a positive social impact. And the positive social impact is somewhat different.
So, Prof, what you actually say is this, if I got it correct, steward leadership actually combines both ethical leadership as well as sustainability leadership?
So yes, you're right. They are necessary to stewardship, but not sufficient.
Oh,
And
so
that's
it
why
goes wider
it
than...
goes wider than that.
I see, I see.
You have, if you want, the great stewards of the year of the world, right, are able to create value, to generate new businesses. And if you think of the Tatas or the Buffetts, etc., right, they're able to do more than just being sustainable or ethical, right?
That is true.
So this is really what stewardship is about. And that's why, and I wouldn't want to confuse your listeners, that's why this has become the standard word in the financial markets. You don't hear Larry Fink talking about ethical leadership. People are really talking about stewardship code. You don't have ethical leadership codes, right?
Correct.
You have stewardship codes, right?
Correct.
So this has become the standard, but the concept is a bit difficult. So I think it's very good to start with an explanation of that. And to me, that combination of long-term, having impact, and being good to society, right? These three dimensions is really what creates stewardship.
Actually, Prof, you mentioned something that's very good, which I actually want to go on, if I may, on stewardship generally. Post the global financial crisis, it seems that the term stewardship has been locked in or has become a common buzzword. And now, you know, if you read, you'll come across board stewardship, you have institutional shareholder stewardship, you have corporate stewardship, and recently I even came across the word regulatory stewardship.
Yes.
The question that I wanted to ask, Prof, is why and how has stewardship actually found its way in business, leadership, and governance, Prof? And, you know, is there a common theme that resonates across these various phrases, you know?
Yes, very much so. Another buzzword a few years before has been governance, right? And you have governance of everything now, right? From self-governance to regulatory governance, etc. The difference, I would say, is that governance has been really about the mechanics. Governance, to me, is about the quality of the decision making.
Okay.
And it's been about the mechanics a lot, right? It's been about size of board, independent directors, you know, structures, etc., right? Which is important, and quality governance is important. But we're moving from what I would call mechanical governance to values-based governance. So another way of expressing stewardship to me is values-based governance. And it's having the right values. So there is a commonality to all of that, right? Which is a level of governance, right? Making the decisions as a group and figuring out what is the right decision for the organization, whether it's a regulator or a corporate or a non-profit or a government. There's there are differences, but there are no limits, I would say, to the word of governance. And at the same time, having these values of contributing to society, not extracting value to society from society. We have seen too many businesses that made their shareholders rich on the basis of extracting value through, tax schemes or through environmental schemes or, simply through subsidies, etc. Right? So it's really about adding value to society and taking a fair share of that added value, right, to the investors. So there is a dimension of fairness as well. So if you want, this is the ideal of leadership. This is the ideal of leadership. And the ideal of governance.
I like the word value-based governance, which you say is the ideal for leadership. If that's the case, then can I'd like to share with you a quote that I came across while preparing for this. The quote says something this: the greatest lesson you might ever learn in this life is this: it is not about you. Right? So focusing on steward leadership specifically, Prof, who are steward leaders and why do we need such leaders?
So first, ideal stewardship is a system more than a leader. It's not an individual. I think the quote that you have is really about that. It's not about an ego, right? And so in the 80s, we've developed leadership theory. The Jack Welches of the world, the bigger man or bigger woman, right? Which we're coming back from, right? So stewardship is about a certain level of humility and being grounded and having a sense of the right values, etc. So I would say there is a dimension there that is different almost from leadership, right? Leadership, by the way, it's an interesting development of the corporate world. In the 17th, 18th century, we invented administration, right? It's the East India Company or West India Company, both actually. In the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, we invented management, the ability to get to results, the ability to get to efficiency. Administration was about rules and procedures. Then it's really about, efficiency management. Henry Ford, Alfred Sloan, right? So the car manufacturing industry. In the 70s, it's only in the 70s that we invented the theory of leadership. Leadership exists before, but the theory dates back only from the 70s. And this is about energizing, motivating people, and taking an organization from A to B. And then now we got into governance, right? And governance is really about balance and about the quality of the decision making and taking the different stakeholders, figuring out together what the best decision for the organization and for society. And as we've said together, right, stewardship is really about values-based governance. So that's how I see that evolution in the system.
Prof, could you give us some examples of who you consider as a good example of a steward leader, which our audience can actually relate to, and why do you take them as steward leaders? Why do you categorize these examples as steward leaders?
So I'm often asked that question, and let's be very clear, right? There is no ideal answer. Everybody will have some qualities in a certain area, right? And but if you think about it, it's a bit like asking who's the healthiest person in the world, right? And obviously, right, everybody has a little ailment somewhere, right? So there is always something, right? So I'm going to give you examples, right? But we have to be careful, right? So they're examples for a certain dimension. So obviously, Tata, for example, in his contribution to community has been one. You could obviously, you have some of the leaders in this country here in Malaysia that we are sitting in right now also have been in the past. I really liked Matsushita, Konosuke Matsushita in Japan, who in the 30s had developed what he calls the seven spirits, which are very close to modern corporate values of contribution to the society, teamwork, etc. I think today, when you ask around, and we've done that actually, we've done polls around, the person that comes at the highest in reputation is Bill Gates. But it's not because of Microsoft, it's because of the Gates Foundation and his reinvention of philanthropy. Warren Buffett typically comes number 2 as well. So you see, all of these individuals, right, are part of that game. Paul Polman at Unilever, at building brands, taking into account stakeholders. One of the board members tell me this is really the best board she's seen in terms of stakeholder involvement. So I would say stakeholder involvement, probably Unilever. So many different actors on different dimensions. And then we could talk about political stewardship, which is an interesting one as well.
So I suppose what you're saying here is that there are different traits. You can't sum it up all together in one, but there are different traits to look at.
That's correct.
Which then brings me to my next point. I used to think that there was a lot of similarities between servant leaders and steward leadership. Yet I came across this saying that was quite interesting that says all stewards are servants, but not all servants are stewards. So your point is correct, right? It emphasizes this.
Yes, thank you. It's really about that added values, that growth, that innovation. You see, characteristics of companies that are well stewarded is a very interesting combination of conservatism, typically quite close to country values, low debt, high liquidity, with innovation. A lot of dynamism, a lot of R&D investments, etc. So it's an interesting combination that I think is a good characterization of what you get in stewardship. It's values-based, but dynamic and creating value.
Prof, when I was reading on stewardship, I came across the statement or this proposition that says that leaders only take stewardship approach at a more mature end of their age spectrum. And to some large extent, personal factors like experiences, insights, and beliefs actually play a critical role in framing a steward leader. So if that is the case, Prof, is it possible for organizations then to nurture stewardship? And if the answer is yes, how can organizations do so?
So yes, the answer obviously is yes. You see, in the old times, people were saying, can you teach leadership? And yes, you can teach leadership. People were saying, oh no, leadership is something more. No, not true. I mean, we teach leadership very well. Can you teach ethics? Can you make someone more ethical? Yes, of course, we can make people more ethical. There is no question about that. And same thing for stewardship. So how do you do that? Well, I think, you know, if you're a regulator, right, it's not so easy to regulate, right? And
yes,
say, okay, true. You know, from now on, right, you'll do this. But what you see, okay, several dimensions. Integrity, right? So integrity is something that you can foster by role modeling, by transparency, by ethics boards, right? By so many different ways, right? It can come from the cultures, can come from structures. But ethics is not enough, right? Doing the right thing is not enough, right? It's about that innovation, that, you know, capacity at inventing oneself, that dynamism, that agility, combined with resilience. So for that also, and you can foster innovation. You know, some of the Silicon Valley learning, not on the ethics side, because that's not where you want to go to Silicon Valley for, but on the dynamism, on the agility side, you know, the fail often to succeed faster, right? How do you generate safety around failing? Stan Shi at Acer has been quite good at fostering trust amongst employees, etc. Another example of steward leader. So all these dimensions, in my view, are ways towards stewardship. Now, with of course, the future. What does the future hold, right? We're seeing now social credit scoring happening in China, or beginning
Yeah.
to happen in China. Is this a way, or is this a threat? I don't know. I think de facto it's going to happen. It may not be government control and used as a systematic tool, but I think de facto it's going to happen, and thus, you know, what are the consequences of that, I think, is a big question to regulators. But overall, what I would do as a regulator is look into the best practices. What are the great, well-stewarded organizations do, right? And how do they figure things out? And how can we inspire ourselves, right, to figure out the best regulatory framework for that?
Thank you, Prof, for sharing your insights and your feedback to the questions that I had posed. On behalf of the IOSCO Asia Pacific Hub in Kuala Lumpur, we'd like to thank you for participating in the regulatory dialogue that we've had today. We've learned a lot from you on stewardship. Now it's for us to go back and use it. Thank you.